The last section, the fourth section of the Satipatthana, Four Foundations of Mindfulness, is a curious Pali word, Dhammanupassana, and it has to do with, it's often translated as reflections on Dhamma objects, or mind objects even sometimes, none of which ever made sense to me, so I retranslated that as Dhamma categories. And I spent a good deal of time, perhaps even whole retreats, talking about the subjects in this last category. And this is a very loaded category. So it has what I call drop-down menus, and they're numerical. And that's also a clue to the fact that monks were memorizing this, and in fact, all of the course, the entire Pali Canon, all the materials in it were kept in memory. And so that's some of the reasons for the repetitions, the overlaps, and the formulas. The nature of the language of the Pali Canon, it's convenient for memory, and also for rehearsals. How do we keep it in memory? Groups get together and recite the material, or perhaps we say chant the material. And you'll see this to this day, monks spending quite a bit of time chanting in groups. But that is not necessarily that the Buddha spoke that way, but he was a good teacher, and that was the standard practice of the time to give these numerical memory structures. And so we have a whole category of the Pali Canon called the numbered sayings, and then things linked by themes, connected sayings, longer length sayings, middle length sayings, and then a whole anthologies of smaller sayings. The Dhammapada, for instance, is an anthology of short sayings that monks collected, kind of the Reader's Digest version of Buddhism. So the Mahasatipatthana is the 22nd sutta in the longer length sayings, the Digha Nikaya. And these suttas are compilations, probably. If you're a person who goes and memorizes with a certain group of monks, they may retain the longer length sayings. And so part of this is structure, and one should not get carried away with too much literalism about these things. These things are to be unpacked and reflected on and meditated on, and also to be put in your own language, how you wish, instead of too many rigid sort of ideas about language. You have to understand what is being said here. So the first category of Dhamma categories is the five hindrances. I just want to go through briefly what is contained in this. And it's the five hindrances, and then the five khandhas, the five aspects which comprise a human, kind of a nice handful of ways of looking at the entirety of a being, a human being. Then the six objects of sense and the six sense consciousness. Then 7 factors of awakening. Then, not surprisingly, the Eightfold Path, or the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So there you see some clear evidence of numerical memory structures. 5, 5, 6, 7, 8. I tend to focus, I think the most basic version of this sutta, the last section of this sutta, would be simply 2 things: 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of enlightenment. The other elements, the 5 khandhas, the 6 sense bases and their objects, and the Eightfold Path, I mean, really, the Eightfold Path is suddenly packed into the seventh factor of the Eightfold Path. So it's a very contorted, reflective kind of structure, recursive kind of structure. It reflects on itself. It goes round and round in circles. The Eightfold Path is in the seventh factor is in the Eightfold Path, around and around you go. So when you look at this, if you want the pared down version, which is very useful, you just stay with the 5 hindrances, which are something that you should be absolutely thoroughly acquainted with. And this has to be at the tip of your fingers. This is not something that you need to to type into Google to figure out what's going on. This stuff is with you all the time. You have to be extremely aware of it and up on it, and you have to know all about each of these hindrances. Because these hindrances are in contradiction to these 7 factors of awakening. These two things the 7 factors are going to replace the hindrances. The hindrances are in contradiction, they're in opposition to the 7 factors of awakening. So this needs to be reflected on, and you need to really know these 7 factors inside out as well. And so this course, I'm going to give you some overviews of this, but this is something you would consider again and again. Now, I've given whole retreats just on the 7 factors of awakening. But whenever you talk about the 7 factors, you have to talk about what they aren't as well as what they are, and so the 5 hindrances come up. So the 5 hindrances are irritants, or psychic irritants, or psychic problems. They're more or less the explicit experience of suffering. The deeper roots of those hindrances are called the samyojanas, the roots, the chains, the bonds of that are latent in the human personality. And it's out of this latent source that these explicit moments rise. So anger is always latent in a person. So people are not angry all the time, but they have a latent tendency to it. If they haven't uprooted and addressed that deep samyojana, yojana has a kind of a similar to yoke, or a kind of a collar or a restriction. So this is kind of a rope within you that when you come to the end of it, you feel it jerk you back. So just a matter of time roaming around in the atmosphere of reality until you come to the end of your rope. And we have this saying in English as well, I've come to the end of my rope. So the situation, the circumstances that you perceive in reality tell you that you are unable to deal with it any other way than through anger or perhaps despair. So this needs to be undone, and one of the ways to undo it is not just by deep insight into the problematic nature of anger. You are ultimately released by insight, but the process of getting to the point where you can dissolve this fetter, this rope, this chain, this yojana, is gradual. So you do it by attrition. You slowly, each fiber of the rope is weakened. So the process, how do you weaken the hindrances? One way is by deactivating them as much as possible. The less they're used, the less they will have a tendency to keep their strength. So by not using them, they tend to weaken. And so every time, and this is something you can do every day, is like, well, if I could go, say, 1 hour without the slightest bit of anger and so forth, that's a project that I could probably take on. A whole lifetime without ever being irritated or angry or anything like this is quite a project. But you can do it an hour at a time. You can also do this with the other side of the coin, the greed aspect, desire aspect. So even for 10 minutes. And some people, of course, are plagued by this all the time. They're constantly in a state of hostility and anger and irritability, and others are in a state of delirious desire all the time. And people don't, if they haven't heard this teaching, then and agreed with the teaching, then they don't know any other alternative, because this is very natural to the human mind. This is something nature has bequeathed you, greed and hostility. These are motivations for dealing with the world, but they're not the motivations which the higher, more developed type of human functions under. So you'll see this also in Greek philosophy and so forth. Is an advocacy of rising above these primitive kind of drives, and that you're not really a developed and admirable person until you can overcome your own reactions, your own captivity by emotions and impulses of anger and greed. So a person who has no control over this quickly ends up in jail or cast out of society in some way or another. Because when people act on this, they do irrational things, they step over the boundaries, which we call the laws, and of course manners, etc. So you are destined for exclusion from mainstream society if you are unable to control your angry impulses and your greed impulses. So then the ordinary person is somewhere in the middle, where they have enough control to stay within the bounds, but they don't, usually people don't pretend to be without the emotion, but they are constrained by it enough that they won't step across boundaries regarding other people's well-being, and so into violence and theft and things like this. So the roots of the 5 precepts, the sort of virtue precepts, the moral precepts of not killing, not stealing, no sexual misconduct, false speech in full awareness, and then use of intoxicants. The roots of those are the inability to control one's primary drives, and the primary drives are just greed and hatred. Those are the first 2 of the 5 hindrances. And so this is mindfulness is being brought to bear on this. So mindfulness is to recognize things. Reports from, so remember this, the mindfulness is the sentry, and it looks out, attends to the gate. And through the sense experience, through sight, sound, smells, taste, touches, and ideas, one perceives, has a distorted perception, misinformation and disinformation about the kingdom. And the kingdom is reality, external reality. The information about external reality is conveyed to you through the senses. And there's misinformation and disinformation. And the sentry is asked to interrogate any kind of reports about the kingdom. Now, this may sound, it's interesting, I mean, it makes sense, but it's unbelievably close to how reality works. Right now, in the pandemic, so I want to stay very timely with this. By the way, if this retreat is seen 30 years from now, they'll be wondering, what is he talking about? What pandemic? Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. Right now, there's endless misinformation and disinformation. Where does this thing come from? Was it released from some secret lab in China, or is it just a bat dropping or something like this? There's all kinds of distorted information, which if that that information is not treated properly, then huge consequences can occur. And this is how wars start. I don't need to remind most of you about what was called the weapons of mass destruction, which some sort of fantasy weapons of mass destruction were supposed to be in the Middle East, and the American army went in to get the weapons of mass destruction because the messengers, the sentry, the informed intelligent sentry, I think you call it the CIA, the CIA had misinformation and disinformation, and they presented it, and then a response was taken up, but it was just wrong. So this is, you're in the position, your mindfulness is a form of CIA, a Central Intelligence Agency. You have a Central Intelligence Agency who's supposed to be monitoring for the reality of the world. And if you do not get good information from it, bad things happen, wars start, crazy things happen. All kinds of criminal cases, justice cases, and all kinds of social injustice in history has been committed because of distortion of information. So what is the primary distortion of information? And it's that the anger element has an unwise attention to the fault, and so there is anger generated. The greed element has unwise attention to the beautiful, and so possession and desire is generated. So this is something also to be highly aware of. Now, in a previous talk, I talked about what is the accompanying feeling of anger. The accompanying feeling of anger is unpleasant. Anger doesn't arise except with an unpleasant feeling. Greed arises both with unpleasant feeling and with pleasant feeling. That's information that you really need to reflect on and say, well, why would I want to inflict an unpleasant feeling on myself? And people, basically, unless they have contemplated the nature of anger and the feeling accompanying anger, they are not even aware of it. They've been in and out of anger their whole life, and they still don't know whether it feels good or not. So they haven't really, what does it feel like? What does desire feel like? And then secondly, this other element, what is the cause? How does anger arise? So the Buddha is brilliant in giving you something simple, and it is that you are attending unwisely to the fault. So you don't, when things are just fine, you're not angry. It's because your attention latches on to the fault, to the exclusion of the whole picture, and the forgetfulness of the nature of this magnification of the fault is the cause for the arising of this anger. What is the cure for the arising of the anger? Wise attention to the fault. By the way, so it's not that if you're free of these hindrances, it's not that you're unaware of the faults of the world. They talk about looking at it through rose-colored glasses, everything's fine and so forth. The Buddha is the last person to say everything's fine. He says everything isn't fine, and it never will be fine. It's, in fact, loaded with problems and faults, and that's why suffering is intrinsic to existence. However, it is how you attend to these faults. So we're in the midst of a pandemic. How will you attend to it? Is this a cause for despair? Is this a cause for frustration? Is this a cause for hostility? I mean, people channel it in all kinds of ways, like, who started this? I'm going to get them. Maybe it's a hoax that we can manipulate somebody. We're all being manipulated. This kind of unwise attention to it and the following up with some negative kind of emotions is the wrong way to look at it. It certainly is a worldwide disease going around. Can you be at ease? Should you be at ease in the midst of it? Yes. And this is called yoniso manasikara. Yoniso as that which goes to the root, and manasikara is the mind doings. And this is the essential critical faculty without which you cannot attain enlightenment. This is the most important internal element. There's one internal element which is critical and one external element which is extremely important. The internal element is the capacity for wise reflection, yoniso manasikara. Can you look upon the world and yourself and reality with wisdom? Can you see its true nature? Can you see its flowing, fluctuating, transparent, insubstantial nature? And can you retain that vision? Can you hold that vision? Can you remember that vision? That's the single most important internal capacity. And the external capacity is a kalyana mitta, a wise friend. Who is this wise friend? For instance, the preeminent wise friend is the Buddha himself. So this is the ultimate kalyana, meaning beautiful. Mitta, friend. Mitta and metta are related words. Mitta is friend and metta is loving kindness. So this external agent, the wise friend, why are they wise? Why are they beautiful? Because they have yoniso manasikara. They have the internal element of wisdom, the capacity to hear Dhamma, Dhamma being just the optimal way of regarding human existence. It's a very practical side of teaching. It's not merely like science, physics, and so forth. Physics is not biased in what it studies. It studies everything and attempts to get accurate accounts of the nature of reality. But the Buddha is saying, actually, there's some sort of priorities in the knowledge structures that you have, what you're going to invest your time in and what you're going to invest your intellect in. And physics is not the best investment. You don't get the best return on your investment by studying physics or chemistry or any of these things. These are even the practical arts or making money or so. These are not illegitimate things. It's just that you don't seem to have something called priorities. And the priority structure, the hierarchy of priorities, is that at the very top is the nature of human suffering, the roots of human suffering. That is the priority, and all of your intelligence and your skill and your capacity should be prioritized that. Everything else is secondary. You need your livelihood. It's all right, you can be a physicist, but understand that it really is not going to solve the essence of suffering. So this is the capacity for wise reflection and to see the faults in the world with wisdom, and then anger doesn't arise with it. You have lucid capacity to see there's all kinds of political shenanigans and social injustice and all kinds of folly and treachery, all these things. The Buddha is fully aware of these, and all wise people should be fully aware of these things. But it's how you look at them and the emotion that accompanies it. So you see it in a larger picture. You see basically the roots of this kind of evil and problematic behavior the cruelty, etc. in the world, the roots of it is just ignorance. So once you understand, well, people do this because they don't know any better. So this is a way of looking at things without igniting this hindrance of anger. Anger, if you recall from a previous talk, is a great stain on the personality, but may be easier than greed to get rid of. Greed is another is caused also by unwise attention to the beautiful, and so you see in a deceptive way, you see what is intrinsically impermanent as permanent. This investment in things is that you forget the transient nature of things. It's quite appealing, it's quite beautiful, but something has been forgotten, is that it's intrinsically going to evaporate on you, dissolve on you. So this is it's like you're a raccoon, and raccoons are very interesting little creatures. They have very human-like hands, very interesting. And they like to wash their food. So I guess they've learned that sand and so forth erodes your teeth. Somehow in evolution they've managed to learn to wash their food. But this, if you give them a sugar cube, they will tend to go and wash the sugar cube. And then they don't have any, where's the food? It's gone. If you give them another sugar cube, they wash it again. So this is, we're a bit like raccoons. Having been given a sugar cube, we have forgotten the transient nature. It's not substantial. It won't outlast the washing. This is true about all things, all levels of beautiful experience. And this is why we're, as I presume that the raccoon is actually quite disappointed to find out that the sugar cube is gone, and we are also disappointed when the sugar cube is gone, when our house is gone, when our health is gone, when our car is gone, when our money is gone, when anything, all of this stuff that we thought was desirable and beautiful is gone. Are we disappointed? Are we shocked? Are we confused? Why would we be? You didn't know that? You didn't know that things are impermanent? So this is wisdom, the application of wisdom to the beautiful, is that one sees it. It's not that you cannot see. The Buddha himself had good taste. He had excellent eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. He had all of the sensory apparatus was intact. He also had a very good, subtle sense of what was thought by the world, as he would say, so that the world considers that beautiful. The world considers that not beautiful. He knew this, but he was very careful to express it that way, because he said, yes, that's what the world calls beautiful, but what happens is people invest unwisely in that, the beautiful aspect of that object or that person or that situation. And so he is able to see these things. He's able to see the fault, the ugliness of the world, and he's also able to see the beauty of the world, but he's able to see this with wisdom. And so this is very important, and this has to be processed again and again. It's very easy when you start doing your meditations and hearing about Buddhism. It's to think that everything, somehow you should never taste anything good again. It's neither good, doesn't taste good or bad, etc. So these things remain. Your relationship, your ability to appreciate or see these things remain. But it's your emotional relationship to these things that changes. So this is how these five hindrances work, and you need to really practice a lot with this. The idea of the accompanying feeling of anger, the accompanying feeling of greed. By the way, so greed is accompanied by joy sometimes, and if, for instance, you have made a commitment not to eat ice cream because you're on a diet, but it's 9 o'clock and you just saw something on television that had ice cream in it, and then you think, there is ice cream in the fridge, right, I'm not supposed to, but I'm going to override that determination. I am going to the fridge now. Each step, I have a smile on my face. I eat every spoon. I take the ice cream out and I eat it, and every spoon I enjoy. Afterwards, I think, what did I do? I just broke my diet. Why did I do that? You might have an accompanying sense of guilt or remorse about it, but you had joy in the taste and in the anticipation of the experience. So, or you could actually have a kind of a swing back and forth between this desire for the taste and despair at your inability to stay on a diet. So, desire comes up with pleasant feelings sometimes, negative feelings sometimes, and kind of swinging back and forth between them. So this is something to know and rehearse again and again, to observe it, so that you're not just taking my word for it or the Buddha's word for it. You see it in your own direct psychological experiment. This is just a little experiment. This is Pavlov's dogs. You can run the experiment on yourself, so you don't have to take anybody else's word for it. This is what what they mean by the Dhamma is directly visible here and now. Dhamma is directly visible here and now by you, not by secondary sources. It begins, though, by hearing it from somebody else. And then you think, let me just check that out. And by the way, the Buddha invites you to really put these things under scrutiny. He says, he calls Dhamma is like gold. Gold, and in the time of the Buddha, currency was traded in gold. But there was all these nefarious people who wanted to, coat lead with gold and so forth, and so you never knew whether. So they had tests, and you burned it and you cut it and etc. And the more you do that, the more it shines. So he says these teachings are like gold. Go ahead, test it, see if it's real. Cut it, burn it, test it. And the more you test it, the more it shines. It's not like some people will benefit by the absence of the diminishment of anger or greed, and others won't. It doesn't work that way. All will benefit from that, these diminishments. Because they allow the mind, the universal nature of the mind, to come back and to lighten up and to be luminous and free. And so this is the Buddha saying, this is a kind of a repressed and defiled by these unskillful attitudes to reality. The mind is, why you feel like you do is because you're in a constant state of some abusing your own mind, abusing the nature of the mind. And of course this thing is struggling all the time because you are ladening it with these unskillful emotions and thoughts and so forth. What happens if you stop doing that? The mind deeply appreciates it and comes back and it just shines. So it's like water. Water is intrinsically just H2O, so it's pure in its nature. But all kinds of things are mixed into it. Mud and impurities are mixed into it, but that's not the nature of water. It's not intrinsically that. If those things are not mixed into it, then the mud settles to the bottom and the water purifies. So the mind is like that. It's like water. The Buddha gives this simile of water many times. The mind is like water. It's intrinsically pure, but things are added to it and distort the nature of the mind. So now you see this even with very young. So it's not a matter of sophisticated thoughts or philosophies. Even with babies, if they're not uncomfortable, the mind comes back, you see this kind of lightness, this shining happiness, puppies, all the intrinsic nature of mind. So this mind thing is not personal. It's a universal quality, consciousness, and it pervades the living universe, and in different degrees of sophistication. But some of its basic nature is like water. It has a purity accompanied by joy and ease and serenity. But there are these other elements that have arisen: greed, hatred, delusion, which cause distress, stress, or suffering in this mind. So this is something very important to keep in mind, is that the Buddha knows more about how your mind works than you do, way more about how it's not your little thing, because you don't know how it works and you didn't make it. It's a universal process, and it works by universal laws, and if you adjust and see these things, then ease will arise. How will you know that you're on the right track? Class? Anybody? You'll feel better. That's why. You will feel better. And this is, it all comes down to feeling. There wouldn't be any talk about suffering and the end of suffering if you didn't feel better. It's not about clarity of thought or anything. Clarity of thought is nice. It's only an assistant to how do you feel. So your heart, your core being, is what the Buddha is talking about. Buddhism addresses that. It's interested in that. What is the experience of being alive? What is it? How do you feel? And if you're burdened, harassed, diminished, all of these things it's a very great misfortune that you are experiencing that when it's unnecessary. So the Buddha is saying, out of compassion, you are suffering, and I'm offering you a way out. This works. It works for anybody with a mind. And so this is the nature of these things. But you have to kind of understand these things and apply these things, and then you will get the result. And the Buddha says, go ahead, test it any way you want, because it just works. That's all it does. But if you don't do it, of course it doesn't work. And it's not by thinking the Buddha is my teacher, or I have done so many bows to the Buddha. That's not how it works. You don't get to join a club. It's not by joining a club. You can't join a society. You can't be a member of a group and get your suffering undone. It's by following these processes, understanding these processes, and applying these. And it doesn't require, high IQ. It's just something that is present and obvious to you. Even children can understand this. So I've just touched on basically the first two of the 5 hindrances, and perhaps you can see why I'm compressing this last section because we have one more talk left, and I'm going to skip over all of those the 6 this and the 5 khandhas and so forth. I'm just going to talk a little more about the hindrances, and then 7 factors of enlightenment. And these are the critical elements of the sutta. The other things, the 6 sense bases and their objects, and the 5 khandhas. 5 khandhas particularly is a very, very important teaching, and you could dwell on that for a whole retreat. Part of the 5 hindrances, 5 khandhas, the 5 elements of a human, so the body, perceptions, feelings, consciousness, and volition. Much of this has already been talked about in the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So we've talked about the body. That's the first khandha. That's the first of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. We talked about feelings. which are the second category of the four foundations of mindfulness. And we also talked about volitions and perceptions, because part of the feelings are that there's psychologically derived feelings and there's physically derived feelings. The psychologically derived feelings are volitions. And then I also specifically talked about perception in about two or three talks ago. Perception, changing, learning to have some control over this. So, and in fact, I've just been talking about it. Seeing an object as repulsive or not. And when we looked at the body, so we could see, some people see the body as beautiful or repulsive, and that you're attempting, by reflecting on this, to change your perceptions of the body. And then consciousness, where does that come up? Consciousness, I keep mentioning this fellow, this king at the center of in the walled city. The Sati is looking down on the gateway, and Samatha and Vipassana, the messengers, are coming and being admitted. Where are they going? They're going to the king at the center of the city. And who is the king at the center of the city? Consciousness. It is the restructuring and reinforming of consciousness. And that will determine the things the king decides to do. Whether to go, if the wrong messengers come in and say, the next kingdom over has a whole lot of treasure and the army's really weak, the king will think, maybe I should go and take over that kingdom. So this wrong information, the sentry has admitted the wrong people, but if it admits samatha vipassana, the message will be, O great king, the kingdom is just as it was yesterday and will be tomorrow. It's impermanent, unsatisfactory, and insubstantial. The king then doesn't really want to go and take it over because it's impermanent, unsubstantial, and unsatisfactory. So that's the information process. Getting the right information about reality changes all your motivations, and all your motivations come out of consciousness. So we just did, in 3 minutes, we took the 5 khandhas all apart and why they're important, but they're kind of included in the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So, I will continue this talk tomorrow. Maybe I'll talk a little more about the last 3 of the 5 hindrances, and I will try to get to the 7 factors of awakening as well in that talk, because that will be the last talk of this series. If you do want more information about this, you will find many more talks by me on the 7 factors of awakening.